Greetings, friend, and welcome to the Between the Covers podcast, where we are working every day to remove the self-limiting beliefs that are preventing us from becoming the heroes of our own stories. I am Marcus Spar, and today, well, not just today, this entire month actually, since it's February, in honor of Valentine's Day that takes place in a week, just over a week, and also what a lot of people have coined as International Singles Awareness Day. I was thinking that it would be apropos right now to focus our episodes this month on purity culture. Now, it is something that I've already talked about in a previous episode. This time we're going to be looking at it from a much deeper perspective. And I will admit, before we get in here, that I did not have the hardest life with purity culture compared to a lot of other people. However, season 3 of the Sunday School Dropouts podcast with Laura Anderson and Andrew Curbs, they are looking entirely at purity culture, and let me tell you, some of the stories that I've been hearing, incredible the amount of damage and harm that has been done to people in the name of purity, and the very strict definitions that many conservative Christians will view purity through. Now, I do want to say here at the beginning that this is one of those episodes that's probably going to be more theologically heavy, and I just want to offer this trigger warning to anyone that if this is something that is challenging for you to listen to, if this is something that can cause some dysregulation, it's not going to hurt my feelings if you have to pause, or even if you have to skip these episodes and maybe come back to them later, if at all. What I want to encourage you to do is to listen to your body and take appropriate precautions in these episodes here when we're talking about a very prominent and touchy subject. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. For this week's discussion, I want to talk about the concept of holiness over happiness, and how, granted, I'm agnostic now, I tend to look at life the opposite of that. Well, not the reverse of that. I look at life in terms of happiness over holiness. Because what is holiness? Well, according to the Christian Bible, holiness is to be set apart. That's why the God of the Bible is looking specifically at the Israelites and saying, you need to be set apart as holy. A little bit of redundancy there. But he wanted, and yeah, I just realized I used the very patriarchal pronoun for the God of the Bible that is everywhere in that book. But this God wanted the Israelite people to really stand out from the culture that they lived in. If we take a look at the Bronze Age that this book and a lot of these writings took place in, when we're looking specifically at the Old Testament, you see a lot of examples of people who are, as the Bible would say, worshiping idols. They are sacrificing animals, supposedly people, possibly even children, to these gods in order to receive their blessings. And I am reminded also of the law of lex talionis. Lex talionis? Yeah, one of those two. And it's effectively an eye for an eye. And then we also have that very interesting saying that an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind, because we're all going to fall short in some form. We're all going to fall short in some way, in multitude of manners. However, the purpose of this holiness that was described in the Old Testament is to make the Israelites different, to make their actions different from the rest of the world. It sets them apart. And this is something that I have even seen in the New Testament, how the early Christian church did a lot of things that were countercultural under Rome during that time. They were looking out for the more marginalized. They were coming together in order to take care of the needs of the entire community instead of just looking out for themselves and their own family. And there's definitely a lot more there than I'm even talking about. However, the whole premise of seeking holiness over happiness is to set yourself apart. Well, if the culture of our day, and bear in mind, a lot of this came around in the 80s and the 90s. God, well, I think it was the 80s. There was the satanic panic that happened, and I remember growing up with the concept of stranger danger and children being kidnapped by random people that you didn't even know. And then you take a look at some of the stats, and a lot of this harm was actually done by people who were very familiar with the parents, with the children. They were close friends or even family members. But this is kind of the birthing ground of purity culture. And with purity culture, the whole point was to remain pure. And what was that? Well, according to the Christian tradition, it was to remain sexually celibate until you were married. What this ended up doing, however, was it created a dynamic in which sex became a taboo subject. It wasn't something that was often talked about in a lot of homes and families. And sex education has to come from somewhere. And so we ended up seeing a lot of schools take on this role of teaching kids about sex and sexuality. What is sexual intercourse? What is safe sex? What are potential contraceptives and ways to avoid pregnancy? And in purity culture, it was abstinence only. That was what I was taught. It was abstinence only. The only thing that was the most surefire way to keep yourself from receiving any kind of sexually transmitted disease or potentially getting someone pregnant was to just abstain from sex. And while well-meaning, these messages also caused a lot of harm. There was a push to prevent people from getting divorced. I remember when I was in high school, there were a lot of kind of side conversations that were taking place whenever anyone was talking about or followed through with a divorce. When my parents divorced, there was a lot of taking sides and almost cannibalizing of the characters of my parents. And that was because they did not remain pure. They had made some poor decisions and they went against the will of God. However, the harm that this causes is immense. What we end up seeing is research that comes out that says individuals who grew up in like very strict purity culture environments end up coming out of it with symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. We have people who are so fraught with their lack of self-esteem and self-worth that they are so easy to take advantage of. You have people that are living in shame, in guilt and shame about what is deemed a lustful thought. Taking a second glance at someone that you find attractive, having your eyes linger on them for a while, having any kind of thoughts or fantasies about some kind of sexual act, whether we're talking something like sexual intercourse or maybe it's even just as benign as kissing. I have heard stories from people who went so far as to abstain from holding hands while they were dating someone, because you know the logical follow through, as soon as you start holding hands with someone, you're immediately in bed trying to have sex with them. That's the messaging that purity culture has brought to a lot of people. The message has morphed and changed over the years, over the decades even, and yet the damage that is instilled on people in the guise of being holy, of remaining pure, in order to have yourself be set apart, is palpable. When I was in high school and college, I was so riddled with my own shame about masturbation and the pornographic fantasies that I would allow to play or I would even create, that there were times where I would take a wooden practice sword that I had since high school and I would almost mutilate my testicles. I would physically harm myself to try and stop myself from following through with some of these desires and these, I mean, let's face it, it was a coping mechanism as well. That's not a healthy thing. That's not a good thing. Why? So I could be deemed as holy in some way? Well, I really wasn't. You take a look at the thoughts that I was thinking and the actions that I was taking when I was behind closed doors and no one else was watching. I was anything but holy. I was anything but pure in those moments. And when we are specifically considering this notion of holiness over happiness, I have found that this is one of the areas that is so rife with hypocrisy that it's not even a joke anymore. We can't even make a joke about the hypocrisy that we see among very staunchly conservative Christians without it ringing more truth than humor. And that's why I want to challenge this notion of holiness over happiness. And when this kind of conversation takes place, there are certain scriptures that people will refer to that point out how it's not happiness that we need to be striving for, it is in fact holiness. There are many examples of this. I'm just going to look at two of them here that I was able to find in the book of Psalms. And the first one is Psalm chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. And that reads, "Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers." So there's some of that language about being separate from these people, not being like the sinners and those who are wicked, and they say the company of mockers. And then we have Psalm 34, 8 to 10, that reads, "Taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the one who takes refuge in him. Fear the Lord, you his holy people, for those who fear him lack nothing. The lions may grow weak and hungry, but those who seek the Lord lack no good thing." Now, these are some examples of biblical scripture that people will use to say we need to be pursuing holiness over happiness. However, one of the things that I want to point out, especially from that second one, is how those who, what was the wording? Those who trust in the Lord lack no good thing. There are a lot of people who trust in God, who trust in the Lord, who are lacking appropriate shelter, who are lacking food, who are in abusive relationships, who have abusive caregivers, who they don't know where their next meal is going to come from. They don't know where they're going to be resting their head. And yet, these people trust in the Lord. And this can bring up some of the Christian beliefs that I have heard so many times about, how God works in mysterious ways and how these trials are going to make us better people. And in my research, I found 3 examples for why whenever you are facing a trial, aka you don't have some of the things that you need, or you're even living in fear, these are 3 reasons for Christians to say it's a good thing. 1, the knowledge that Jesus has saved us and nothing can change that. 2, that this trial is creating in us a greater holiness. There's that word again, the holiness. It is making us more separate from the evildoers, the sinners, the non-Christians. And 3, God is most glorified when his people make much of him in the midst of challenging circumstances. With many, many conversations I have had with clients, some of them who do identify as Christian and some who are questioning their faith, this is one of the things that I have found to be more deleterious in nature than it has been beneficial. Because when we are in these kind of trials, when we are in situations that are challenging, when maybe we are lacking in some very basic necessities, these people will turn around and they will give praise to God and say, "Thank you so much for this challenge because of these examples. It is making me a better person. It's making me more the person that you want me to be. This isn't going to take away from the sacrifice that you have made for my eternity." Now, for someone like me, I don't believe in eternity. I don't know if there is even anything that follows this. And so, what is this holiness doing? What is this being set apart and being separate doing? In a lot of cases, what I'm seeing is it's causing harm. It's causing real harm to people. I have a client who, in the couple of years he and I have been working together, he has been in and out of secure housing. He has had to figure out what to do with his kids when he's moving from one family member's place to another family member's place, not knowing where he is going to be laying his head. And these family members, they do love him, and yet their charity seems to only go so far. The inconvenience of their charity only goes so far. And he has really struggled with knowing how he's going to provide for his kids when sometimes he's working multiple jobs in order to try and make ends meet. And it is causing some harm in his kids. His kids not having a secure place to stay, having to move from school district to school district, sometimes even moving from one state to another, just to try and follow wherever he can find the best stability for his kids. And this is one of those things for me where when we're talking about a group of people that say how important it is to give to others, how important it is for charity, and yet that charity needs to stay within their building, within their organization, and there are so many other people who are hurting. I mean, I help people with maladaptive coping mechanisms on a weekly basis. The reason why they're turning to these coping mechanisms is because they're hurting. They are trying to eke out some semblance of comfort in an area where they have nothing but pain and fear and uncertainty. And these people who are meant to be set apart as holy, they are focusing more on their upward mobility in many cases than anything else. Or, heaven forbid, they should give something to help someone who's not a part of their organization. So let's look at this in terms of, instead of holiness over happiness, which is the message that purity culture has taught, let's look at life in terms of happiness over holiness. Now, don't get me wrong, there are many Christians out there, some of them good friends of mine, that when you look at how they live life and they are grateful and they are observers and practitioners of their faith and they take it very seriously, some of these people are incredibly happy and joyful people. And a big part of this is how there is a misconception that happiness is based on circumstances. I tend to look at it more as happiness is a choice. We can choose to be happy. Does that mean that sometimes our situation and circumstances are less than ideal? Of course. I don't know of anyone who hasn't been there. And yet, we can still practice gratitude and choose to be happy, whether we are in a relationship, whether we are looking, or whether we are single. If we are so determined that our happiness is going to come from some external source, whether that be a relationship with someone, whether that is being in a community of people that share similar faith traditions, whether that is listening to teachers ministers, pastors, and priests tell you how you can find this joy and happiness. If you are looking for this happiness externally, then yes, it's always going to be based on circumstances. And I can also tell you, as someone who has almost been married for 16 years, that if you're looking to someone else for that joy and that happiness, you're putting your eggs in the wrong basket. That is not how you're going to find happiness. You can be happy when you are in a relationship. However, it adds its own level of complications that makes it more challenging oftentimes to be with someone in such a close and intimate way as a romantic relationship than if you are just making some of these decisions on your own. Now, we are a social species, even if we're introverted. Like my partner Libby and I, we're both more introverted, she more so than me. And yet, even introverts require having that very close connection with other people. A big dynamic of it is the kind of people and even the quantity of people that you have in your life. If you are wanting to have a romantic relationship with someone and you find yourself scared to, say, approach someone, then it might be worth asking the question of, is this something that I truly want? And if so, why do I want it? And if I do want it and I'm really struggling to make any necessary changes for this to become a reality in my life, then what's getting in my way? A lot of times it could be something that you have learned. I did not start dating anyone really until after I graduated from high school. Now, I do remember in the 3rd grade having a quote unquote girlfriend, but when I was maturing, we'll say, when I was maturing, when I was developing, when I was a teenager, when I was a young adult, I chose to not even approach having a romantic relationship with anyone until about my senior year in high school. And even then, I didn't have my first girlfriend until after I had graduated. Why? Because purity culture had taught me so much that made me believe that because I was missing this mark on what it is to be holy, that I was a terrible, rotten person, that I was a voracious beast as a man who could not control my sexual desires. And therefore, being romantically involved with anyone was going to only cause harm and was, oh, lo and behold, make me fulfill this destiny of losing my purity, even though I would not define myself as being pure at all in those days. But at least my impurity wasn't sexual intercourse before I was married. At least I still had that. But the shame that I carried the hatred I had for myself, the hatred that I, as a heterosexual cisgendered man, had against women because they would wear clothes that I would deem as a little too revealing and therefore was making me stumble. I was taking the ownership of my mistakes and putting them on others. And guess what? That made me incredibly unhappy. I was doing what I could to try and meet this standard that, to my understanding, no one has ever met. And I found myself not only lacking in this holiness, I was also lacking in my own happiness. What does happiness in a relationship look like? A great example is Libby and I. We had a very tough conversation just over this last week. And it was a conversation that really needed to happen. And in all honesty, it needed to happen sooner than it did. However, when it did happen, we were able to clear the air about some things that were causing a lot of disconnect between us. A lot of fear that I had, a lot of emotional disconnect. My lack of desire to even be emotionally connected with Libby. And because we went through those difficult conversations and we got ourselves on the same page and we were able to be vulnerable with each other, we are now experiencing an incredible depth of happiness. Well, that's kind of a requirement for any relationship, whether we're talking romantic or platonic. We are talking about needing to navigate difficult conversations and situations where we have to be vulnerable in order to let these people see us in the most downtrodden, most beat up, most vulnerable. And what we have to do is, if we want to find that happiness, then we also need to take on the risks that are involved. We need to have the bravery to have these difficult conversations. We need to be able to be our authentic selves and know that the other person is not going to try and change us. When you are seeking happiness, don't try and find it in someone else who is either going to try and change you to be someone different or who you want to change to be someone different. Find someone who is going to love and accept you for the bizarre, the radical, the weird, the obscure, the strange person that you are. That you are a fan of whatever you are a fan of, that you have dislikes that are unique to you, and that you are willing to accept the other person for who they are, flaws and all. That is where you're going to find happiness. And a big thing about this is, if this is something that you want, if you want a loving and accepting relationship, if you want to have a relationship where you and someone else, or maybe even multiple people, if it's an open relationship, are consenting to these agreements and these activities, and yet you're continuing to do the same thing that you have done, then it might be time to rethink your strategy a little bit. Don't put yourself in danger by any means. However, Sometimes in order to find what it is that we desire means we're going to have to do things a little differently than we have been in the past. I wish that I met Libby when I was not in the throes of my own struggle with shame about purity. And yet, our relationship is so much better now that we have stepped away from that. The holiness was not making us happy, and that was a lie that we were told by our Christian communities. What made us happy was knowing that there was someone who knew deep down how much we have failed, the harm that we have caused, and they still said, hey, I'm here with you. Now, individuals who are Christian will say, but that's how God works. For someone like me, I never felt that. I never felt the presence of God. I can distinctly recall one time hearing words. And I was just running around the house while I was cleaning, and I heard some words of like, what's the rush? I never felt truly connected to this God that I was told loved me, no matter what I did. And that's a part of my faith journey. That is a part of where I am and why I'm here as an agnostic who is okay with the uncertainty and the mystery of it all. And you know what? I'm happy with that. I am happier now than really I ever was as a Christian. And for me, that's why I'm choosing happiness over holiness. In these modern times, when it's all about what do you believe, are you the right kind of Christian in this Christian nationalist movement that's taking place globally here? When I find myself happy with my relationship with my chosen family, with the family that I am still close to, that's actually where I find myself set apart from many of these others who are just so full of hatred, who are so full of fear. So for me, I'm going to choose happiness. If this is something that you're interested in having a conversation about, get in touch. I'm happy to see if there's some way that I can help put a different perspective on some of the messages and the beliefs that you have been spoon-fed to certain extents. But I'm happy to offer an outside perspective to see if there is something else that can be done to undo these messages of purity culture in order for you to find that happiness. And until next time, live strong for today.